Hello? Testing, bonjour. Can everyone hear me back up in the back? Is that fine? Okay. I'm very honored and excited to be here today, and thank you for coming out in the storm. The talk will be really about the history of my work, focusing on recombinant music, but really my work is always about fields of meaning that relate to image, music, and text that all operate on each other with a kind of ongoing meaning summing. The first work I'm going to talk about, Navigating and Negotiating Sound Architectures of the Night, was done as a PIP seminar at RPI. I was lucky to work with Pauline Oliveros in the last period of her life. It was a work that was done with a number of different people. And I'm just going to play a bit of the video here. Basically, it's a work for an interface table with a series of architectural elements, each one tied to a musical loop, and also to spatial positioning of the music in the space. It's very hard to make interactive works that have interfaces that multiple people can use, and you'll see that this one has many, many people using it simultaneously. The notion also is that this might be used as a generative sketching tool for architecture. So as you can see, they're putting architectural objects onto the table, and when they do this, a code is read, and a virtual image is projected of the architecture. And the idea was that you could also put objects next to the architecture that would alter or abstract the architecture. So you might multiply it by 10 or make it curve and so on. And you can see that people are moving things around, and as they move around, a simultaneous movement's happening on the screen. The soundtrack is a generative one. Each architectural object has a loop that goes with it. But we also had a series of musicians from Pauline Oliveros' class. So the whole project was really a student project from many different areas. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. I've been doing, as Jean said, a series of individual solo CDs. Erasures and Displacements came out earlier this year. On my website, billseaman.com, you can hear many different music. So instead of playing that now, I'm going to focus on interactive things. Luminous Hands. I'm a member of the Duke Institute of Photonics, which has been quite exciting. And I collaborated with Sonke Johnson, who's very interested in bioluminescence, and made a kind of database of bioluminescent sea creatures. And we did a generative virtual environment. So when I say generative, it means that there's a database of elements, there's a series of architectures, images, behaviors, and also a generative music soundtrack. And the system is actually building it as people navigate. So imagine you're wearing an Oculus Rift and you're in this very large space, but here's a kind of fly-through video to give you a feeling for it. And I was working with Todd Barrett programming. Usually I design the system and work with a programmer to implement it. So you have to imagine, if you are navigating in this space, can you turn the music up a bit more? The sound, yeah. If you are navigating in this space, the music would actually change based on your trajectory. The space also had A-life parameters, so you can see these kind of reeds that are moving, a series of sprites that come in. But you have to imagine that when you're experiencing this, it's a fully immersive VR space, so you can look in every direction. Usually I've been making VR that you just look at. Only in the last couple of years have the goggles gotten to the level of resolution that I like. Okay? So a work with John Supko, who I'm doing the operand with. We're very interested in exploring AI and AI machines that help us build music. And in this S-Traits album, we collaborated with an AI, generated about 70 hours from little machinic systems that we built, and then made a final album with 26 tracks on it. And I'll play you just a little bit of that. And the ice appeared blue. There's an elaborate poem that's a kind of meta text related to Kenneth Koch's Straits poem, a very abstract poem. And so this huge poem that's on the cover of the CD, we just have 26. You see the slightly bluer sections there. I did a very large project with Craig Tattersall, and our band name is the Seaman and the Tattered Sail. And we did a double vinyl, a double CD and a DVD. And in this case, the recombinant nature had to do with the DVD, playing tracks back in different orders. But often I'll title a track as a kind of poem in itself. So when they recombine, they also recombine as a kind of poem. It was quite elaborate, very beautiful, clear vinyl, and Craig also did a series of pinhole camera images to go with the work. And as Jean said, I've always been interested in time and kind of meta time works. The Engine of Many Senses with Todd Barrett was work, let's see. I was very interested in the history of computation and also the future, and made a series of what I might call allegorical computational machines. And so again, this is a database piece that draws from a series of still images, a series of architectural forms, a generative text, and also this generative music. It's kind of interesting to note that I write kind of scientific papers at the same time as I do my poetic work. And as I've gotten older, I've done more in the research side. And I was included in a book called, it was about mathematical biology, basically. And what I proposed in the text, which is a text that's the kind of counterpoint of this work, that it might be interesting to take many different kinds of computers that we have today that reflect different kinds of computation in the body. So we might have quantum computing and biological computing and on-off in the same way of synapses and neural transmitters as kind of analog code, and bring all of those computers together into a network to actually study and think about how are those kinds of computation working in our body. It was a very interesting project. I was the one non-mathematician, but it was really thinking about how do we really look at the body, the biology of the body in terms of new mathematical structures. The Engine of Engines with Daniel Howe, I've done a few different works with him as well as musical albums. This was a generative projected visualization and sonification environment. So this is kind of interesting, taking the idea of visualization and sonification, but making an artwork out of it. So we took the entire set of computing at City University. Some of you might know this famous Daniel Libeskind building that's very skew. And we use that as a control parameter in the work. And here's what the work looked like and sounded like. This was, again, playing with this kind of allegorical visualization of computing. In that case, it was nanotechnology. So this had very different kind of mood states depending on how the machines were being used upstairs. A China of Many Senses is a work I went to China a few different times and created a major work out of both architectural elements from China as well as images shot there. And I'm only going to show the stills here. There's a very nice video online if you want to check that out. This is projections on the outside of the Nasher Museum, and they were very large format projections that literally made the building feel like it was a robotic building, that it was changing over time. This is a child reacting to the work. Exchange Fields was a very unique work with the dancer and choreographer Regina van Berkel. And in Exchange Fields, the idea was to have 13 furniture sculptures. I'm sorry that the audio didn't come with it this time, but there were 13 physical audio sculptures. Each one had a drone that would come out of silence and go into silence. So as a generative piece of music, depending on which person interacted with which piece of the installation, different drones would come in, although there was a background soundtrack that was playing continuously. And the idea was to make a kind of very embodied system where you would engage the interface, and then that part of the body would be focused on by the dancer's movements. So there was always this kind of cybernetic loop that was going on. And if two people used it at the same time, it would layer two images together, up to 4 people at one time creating layered images. And the work, initially, all of the works were made with interactive Laserdisc. When I went to MIT in 1983, 84, Laserdisc was the way to deliver interactive video. It's kind of ironic now, if any of you know what HyperCard is. We were actually using HyperCard on a computer to trigger different frames and different orders of frames off of the Laserdisc. Initially, this was very complicated, 4 Laserdisc, video mixers, and so on. After 10 years, Laserdisc had died already, so it's interesting how fast technologies are flipping over. And this IME actually remade it as a digital installation. So outwardly, everything looked the same, but behind the scenes, instead of this huge set of things, there was just one PC, which is kind of nice. So you can get an idea of these different kinds of interfaces. Initially, this strategy was to use 3D to look for gestures of the people. Then we realized it would be much easier to just have a beam. So if they sat down, it would break the beam and tell us that someone was using it. Passage sets had a much earlier version. It's interesting with the kinds of technologies like Macromedia Director that many people used in the 80s and early 90s to make their work totally died. So a lot of those works that were major works kind of had to get put away for the time being. So my thought was, well, could I take these elements out of this earlier work and make a new work? So we made an interactive, again, with multiple sensor units. The work, I'll show the video so you get a sense. The work has 150 images that have a poetic text on the surface of the image. And there's a set of lists of words that more or less build a haiku-like poem. And we again wanted to have multiple people be able to interact with it. It was set up in the basement of a library at Duke. And what we used was a kind of positioning sensor. So if you moved forward, you could scroll through the words in one direction. If you moved backwards, it would go the other way. And if you positioned yourself in the center, it entered that word into the part of the poetic sentence that was there. The whole piece actually functioned as a kind of zoom, a bit like the famous Michael Snow wavelength piece.
One poem's pivots at the tip of the tongue.
So again, this is 1995. This won a prize at Ars Electronica in its original form. I'll show a little bit of that later. But this gives you an idea of this kind of video wall setup. The Architecture of Association was quite an exciting piece. It was a generative video text work with a continuous soundtrack. It's interesting to note that the people behind Watson initially approached us to visualize Watson's thinking related to what this work is. So this was at the Chat Festival, and the idea was that there were a series of meta tags for all of the images and all of the texts. And the computer would choose something and then start associating based on the meta tags until the entire room was filled with these associations. And it had different kinds of states
The Architecture
of
of Association is a large-scale generative artwork that draws associative links between disparate video images and poetic texts to form dynamic and evolving visual and textual collages.
So this room was designed as an internet room with very close throw projectors, so you could walk around and not get into the image.
In 1995, Seaman...
Earlier work, I was invited to the Nabi Art Center, and the SK building at the Nabi Art Center, I had a collaboration with Young Chang. And Nabi has these screens that go around the outside of the building. And they also have screens inside. And Young was a very good graphic designer. So we had a generative system that was both text and then these Korean translations. And the most dynamic thing is this like 90-foot, imagine a screen going across this entire room. And that had a generative work that was being constructed on it continuously. This gives you a sense of some of the graphic design elements. Jean was talking about my interest in time, and very early on I made a work called The Watch Detail. I probably won't play it tonight, but I was very interested in making a meta timepiece. And this was, again, a laser disc. It had a half an hour of different segments, clocks, watches, yards, gardens, and grounds, the airport, and so on. And the idea was I shot the video in very slow zooms. So you could drive the video forward or drive it backwards, but you couldn't really tell which direction time's arrow was going. You could also stop any frame. There was a series of hundreds of poetic texts on time that you could juxtapose with any other image. There was a musical score, but then also if you went into slow motion, it called up sound loops. So it was a kind of meta timepiece. It was me thinking about how do we register time? How do we look at time? Often my music has a very linear, very plateau-like structure, maybe influenced by Eastern music time structures. And if you come to the concert tomorrow night, you'll hear a bit of that. Probably my most major work, and this is my PhD work, The World Generator, the Engine of Desire. This was a very early generative virtual environment, which enabled you to build virtual worlds in real time. The question was, could I design an interface that made it so easy that anybody could just sit down and be able to build virtual worlds? Because at this time, it was not so easy. You had to work with a programmer and do lots of code and so on. So I worked with Gideon May on this, and basically you could see this interface at the bottom of the screen. You could blow it up to full screen. And these are the kind of poetic parts of it. There were certain functions. There were a series of pre-made objects. I write a text. Instead of talking about AI, I talk about re-embodied intelligence. If we think about what our sensibility is, could we write computer programs that more or less take on those sensibilities, and even though we're not there, they still are building or creating or generating new works based on that. So I'm thinking a lot about this idea of computational creativity, about how machines potentially that we can interact with them, we can also collaborate with them. And in the future, there may be a very different kind of moment where learning systems actually might be enculturated and define their own aesthetics. At this moment, it's always us loading the aesthetics. So this had a series of poetic text, it had movies, it had stills, texture maps. And the interesting thing about the audio is that you could preview the sound, and then you could position it in the space as a loop. And you could move somewhere else and position something else and something else. So it was a kind of navigable mix, and depending on where you moved in that space, different musical elements could come up or go down. You could also decide to make a corner of the room as super cacophonous and another part, completely tonal and quiet. The thing that's kind of interesting about it is, and Jean and I were talking about this, my contention in the paper was that we're on the cusp of a new linguistics. Because we can have a consensual domain that has image, music, and text, and because each of those can have a field of meaning that operate on each other, this is very, very different than how a word alone signifies. It's really a kind of system where the interactant brings their associations, circular, causal, cybernetic system. And what's interesting is, instead of writing about meaning and how it arises and changes, in this case, you would actually enact meaning. You would actually be able to watch the difference in your association. This is mindful awareness for some of you who've read Varela, Thompson, and Roach, the embodied mind. This idea that you can become mindfully aware of things as you're doing them. So here's an example of the interface blown up large. I made a kind of joke on Walter Benjamin about, he said that the electronic work of art didn't have an aura. So what did I do? Well, I gave it an aura. So you would know what Erkki Huhtamo calls, in terms of world processing, that there was an object that was selected. So you could do things like put a texture map on the outside of an object that you selected. You could also put a movie on the outside of something. But very excitingly, you could select random all, and it would build a world with sounds and images and texts and so on that you moved through. And later that influenced me to make works where the computer initially pressed its own button, so it was just generating. Now this was, at the time, this was very new. We made a video avatar, and we made a connected system from Tokyo, the Intercommunication Center in Tokyo, and the ZKM, Center for Art and Media. And we sent two signals. One was this video phone signal, which we mapped into an avatar who was in the relative position in the room. So imagine in the way that I see you there, hi, and you can see the back of my screen, and I can see that scarf. In the virtual world, I would see you as a video where you are. So it's this very interesting thing, and you could work together to build the world. What you weren't allowed to do is throw away the work of the other person. So that was the rule for that one. But it made quite complex, beautiful generated environments. And now you have to imagine this is a VR world, but not in goggles. But this one was shown at UCLA, the Visualization Portal, which is this beautiful 40-foot screen. So it's still very immersive. To my mind, it's even more immersive because you're not encumbered. But I think in the next few years that kind of resolution will change. These are other examples. So you have to imagine with these generative pieces, they're always different. They're always new each time you approach it. And so for me, you can have a work that's 20 years old and still enjoy experiencing it because it's actually new for me as a viewer as well as the interactant. Here's the exchange fields work, the original one. So these are some of the objects that we looked at it a bit earlier. These are the interface objects. And Regina is a fantastic dancer. She and I also did a major dance performance work called Inversion, which explored nanotechnology as the subject matter of the work. A very early work, kind of important for me, The Exquisite Mechanism of Shivers, was published on Art Intect, which was a beautiful book series that the ZKM did, which would have a CD-ROM work. The work was shown as installations. It was shown at the Biennale of Sydney as a 10-screen rear projection work. Basically, the work had a kind of poetic sentence with 10 linguistic slots and 33 variables for those slots. And I'm going to slip out to show you what this looks like a bit, if I can. Hello. Yeah. So a sentence might look something like this.
An immaculate operation incorporates an enigmatic gesture to embrace the slippery momentum of an eternal desire.
So these Art Intect, there were a whole series of different ones. Some of you might know Luc Corchen. He was also included on a different one. And so what was interesting about it was you could be an average person, but you could get the perfect version of these interactive works. So here's what the interface looked like. Since there were 33 different sentences, you could, I'll just play this so you get a sense of it. You could actually click on those and shift different words, or you could hit random and it would do a random sentence. Then this little red dot below, I'm sorry, this is how much resolution has changed since the time that this was made.
Certainty
So this is actually choosing fragments from different of the categories.
blends with an indexical coincidence to unleash the negative legions of a sensitive intuition.
So that gives you a bit of a sense of that one. How do I go back? No. So you can see that there are many, many different kinds of ways that I've worked with the generative system. But I showed everything in reverse, but if you think about it at the time, each time I was building to a higher order kind of system. So with this one, you had these very precise modules that you could control and build a sentence. And then I thought to myself, well, if I can build a sentence, why can't I build a virtual world? So that was the kind of jump that went from 2D, from Laserdisc, to virtual environments. The hybrid invention generator, I was given a 3-year Intel research gift when I was teaching at UCLA. And the idea, and I'll just show you what it looks like, was could I make something that would generate inventions in real time and visualize them? So I made all these, it's a very like surrealist piece in a way. I made all of these images that you could, oh, I'm not mirroring, sorry. So when you hit generate, it would do a kind of genetics of the two inventions, 90%, 80%, 70%. And then it would literally give you the model in the space. So the long-term goal was to make that so you could actually print that model out afterwards. But I was very interested in this kind of metaphor of how these kinds of inventions might talk to each other through what I called well, it was a kind of code that would be the output of one thing, would go into the input of another until the two things would actually talk to each other. I was commissioned by Jean Gagnon, who some of you might know, when he was at the Canadian National Gallery. He saw how much my passage sets was influenced by Mallarmé. And so I did a piece called Red Dice, Déchiffré, or Déchiffre. And we took the original Mallarmé text, and this is a kind of set of puns in the red dice, and Déchiffre also has, of course, has sets of puns as well. So the idea was here that Mallarmé made a poem that couldn't quite be performed because it was designed as a kind of proto-hypertext. You could read it in different orders, and that's what I really liked about it. But what I did was record audio, both in French and in English, for each of the sections. And with a pen, a Wacom pen, you could touch, and then you would hear that sentence spoken. So you could, in the same way that you're reading it in different orders, you could touch on it and hear this nonlinear kind of version of it. Now, when you did that, I had written a kind of meta text, a very close reading of the original text, and a little video icon would show up at the bottom. Let me see if I can get back to the right setting here. I guess not. They always get you when you're nervous, you know? So the idea was, if you clicked on the video, you would hear me speak and you would see a video that was kind of this meta imagery that went with it. Then there was one series where you had all of these icons representing each of the different sections. And this became a remix engine. Different audio fragments from that could go together in different ways. Or there were poetic texts that you could also call up from this particular menu. So this gives you a sense of dice thrown, surfaces, the signature of ciphers, recast chance, never. So never is Mallarmé, and then I'm ever, sever, severe, the never meaning throne, ever the reviver, and dimensional, and so on. The passage sets was a very major early work. I showed you the kind of remade version of it. This was also a prize-winning work from Ars Electronica in 1995. The idea was 3 separate screens, and there was a huge image collage with 150 pieces of a poem, and you could zoom in, and it was very influenced by the Mallarmé, so you could read it in different orders and so on. If you touched a word, it took you to this poetic poem generator, and you could scroll through these words, or you could hit random and it would make a random poem. What's interesting is that every word was hyperlinked back to one of those images, of these 150 images. So it was, you could navigate the work over the surface of the images, or you could navigate them linguistically by coming to this menu. On the right-hand side was a video, and this is again a Laserdisc piece. So if I clicked, you would hear the text spoken and see a piece of video that would play out, and then there would be a still frame at the end. So in terms of the generative music, it was playing these sort of pieces of things, and then a reverb, it would kind of die out in terms of the sound. But this gives you a bit of an idea of how the poetic text looked over the surface. And this is the first generative work. I took the periodic table of elements and used it as a structure, so I would have 3 words, like the 3 states of matter for each of the elements. So H, halation hall, harbor, here, heart, hesitation, lily, light, lies, being, bending, bent, backward, baseless, balance, catalyst, cast, catches, nerve, net, node. And so the idea was that I could take any formula, like C16H11, whatever, and repeat those words that amount of time. So it was a kind of generative system based on any it was like a compound poetry is what I called it. And then to end, very, very early proto-locative media work, myself and Carlos Hernandez did a driving tour in San Francisco, treating San Francisco as a giant ready-made. It would start at Lombard Street, and Carlos was driving, and there were many different sound systems in the car and a speaker on the roof of the car. And I was mixing live, and I had composed music for all of these famous things, you know, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Golden Gate Bridge, and so on. But I also mixed it in such a way that if you got stuck at a traffic light, there was a kind of segue music that was working. So each time it generated a different thing. We would drive 3 people per night, and we did that piece 21 times. So that was quite an exciting piece. So I think that's where I'll end, and maybe we could take some questions now. Is that? So thank you very much.